Hi there, I'm Sarah. We are here at the Brooklyn Museum. Well, not really, but I'm here about to talk to you about my grad school thesis research on how characteristics of white supremacy culture show up in American art museums, much like this one. Thrilling, I know. So as an astute viewer, you have probably recognized me from my candidacy for the beigest woman alive. That's right, I'm a white lady who's about to talk about systemic racism. To be honest, if you are not suspicious of that, you probably should be. White women have an incredibly long and incredibly bloody history of not only benefiting from ingrained racism, as with affirmative action, but also legitimizing and instigating the violence that sustains white supremacy and racism over the years, as with Carolyn Bryant lying about Emmett Till. This topic has very real meaning for Black, Indigenous people of color, not just as a past, but as a very real present and future. I do not take this lightly. I anticipate questions and concerns. I hope my presentation offers some insight into what is important to me about this work and why the ways I approach it. However, I am always happy to talk about it further, especially with people of color. So everyone's relationship with whiteness is different. Audre Lorde said, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house." I think about what that means for my relationship to whiteness as someone who lives solidly within the master's house. What does it mean for people like me? How can I leverage the access and legibility I have for anti-racist purposes? But why am I even talking about white supremacy culture and not using some other euphemism that might make white people a little bit more comfortable, like racism? I believe that white supremacy is the water we all swim in. White supremacy is the foundation of white American culture, and it affects the ways we all learn to assign value, treat each other, and make choices based on skin color. White supremacy is often dismissed as something in the past or a caricature of a neo-Nazi tiki torch wielding Proud Boy. But I believe that in order for the level of systemic racism we currently have to be sustained for as long as it has, it logically has to be maintained by more than just these caricatures of white supremacists. I believe it is reaffirmed and built as an accumulation of the large and small choices made by individual people, both consciously and unintentionally, every single day. While that is wildly depressing in many ways, I find a lot of hope in it because I believe it gives people, especially white people, the opportunity to make different choices if we can recognize when we're about to reaffirm the supremacy of whiteness. So this brings me to museums because I work there and it is an accessible entry point for me. I also see them as a meaningful case study for how, for many of the oppressive systems of our society, they have everything. Super wealthy boards of trustees, collections built on and extending the legacy of imperialism into late stage capitalism, the hierarchy of labor, which spans $1 million salaries down to minimum wage workers, and also intersects with an equally strict intellectual hierarchy of labor. A complicated public which includes alienated communities and members who have a hyper-personalized relationship with the museum. I believe if we look at museums as a microcosm of our larger society, we will find accessible entry points to larger dynamics. So that's what I mean by marking the load-bearing walls from the title of this presentation. I want to undermine the master's house from the inside so that the tools that are capable of dismantling it have easier work. And maybe we can focus on all of the amazing, beautiful, inspiring, mediocre, disgusting, terrible, wonderful things being created outside of the master's house. I would love to be able to stop talking about it, but we're just not there yet. So let's do this. So now that we're here at the Met, let's talk about defining some terms. What do we mean by whiteness? So we're talking about Toni Morrison's fishbowl from Playing in the Dark here. She says, "It is as if I had been looking at a fishbowl, the glide and flick of the golden scales, the green tip, the bolt of white careening back from the gills, the castles at the bottom surrounded by pebbles and tiny intricate fronds of green, the barely disturbed water, the flecks of waste and food, the tranquil bubbles traveling to the surface. And suddenly I saw the bowl, the structure that transparently and invisibly permits the ordered life it contains to exist in the larger world." So we're talking about that moment of erasure where whiteness shrinks from definition in order to maintain its power as the standard that defines what is normal. This is done by making us focus on what is inside the fishbowl. White people, by actively and passively maintaining a culture of white supremacy for centuries, have been able to use, as Richard Dyer says, their spirit of mastery over their and other bodies, in short, their potential to transcend their racial bodies, end quote, to create a paradox of power so all-encompassing it's invisible. In shrinking from definition of itself, whiteness extends the power of white supremacy beyond the white body. The absence of itself is often the best indication of the presence of more complicated dynamics at play in order to maintain the power of whiteness. Another way this absence or erasure of itself is used is in the prioritization of the mind over the body. Whiteness is sometimes most visible in its physical absence, in a focus on an intellectual interpretation and experience. And this is especially apparent in museums. Think of all of the restrictions put on your body and the needs of your body as you enter into a museum. No food, no liquids, etc. Or how difficult it is to find any of the amenities that are meant to cater to the needs of your body, like restrooms, restaurants, seating. So to help us identify whiteness in museums because of this incredibly paradoxical definition, we'll also be using the 13 characteristics of white supremacy culture written by Kenneth Jones and Tima Okan, as well as Layla Saad's prompts from her book, Me and White Supremacy, which will be called out in the examples we discuss. But what type of museums are we even talking about? They all share similar characteristics. You might see them here. They are all founded between the Enlightenment and colonial eras, which means they are based, deeply rooted in imperialism. If they were not specifically founded during this time, like LACMA, they are modeled after this standard template created in Europe in the mid-19th century. They also have collections which represent, quote, the world's diverse artistic traditions. That was from the mission statement of the Art Institute of Chicago, and other museums like the Met, MFA Boston, LACMA, National Gallery, etc., have similar phrasing. This, again, gestures from their founding in imperialism. The ways this wealth of culture, so to speak, were accumulated is, of course, based in the violence, theft, and appropriation of imperialism. They also aspire to inspire, quote, the public. There are a lot of tricky things in here that I would like to tease out a little bit. So Tony Bennett, not the singer, wrote in his book, The Birth of the Museum, that these museums were meant as spaces to, quote, elevate the public out of their rowdy behavior. And this is said explicitly by their founders in a clear demonstration of the whiteness we have defined for our purposes. These museums were founded on the idea of creating a unifying idea of, quote, the public for the white populace of sovereign imperialist countries. They did and do this by showing the, quote, primitive other in a capacity that is beneath that of white culture. The result is a united, elevated public of lower class white people who could now see fewer differences than previously between themselves and wealthy white people. Any gesture to change this, which does not address this systemic root of white superiority, will always continue to be a gesture from imperialism. The last aspect of museums that's very important is that staff is majority white and female and has a strict hierarchy of labor. So the Mellon Foundation, of course, performed 2 surveys of demographics of museum staff. In the last one, it showed that museums are roughly 70% white and roughly 60% female. But that increases to roughly 80% white and majority male if you go into what they term intellectual leadership roles, which include curatorial, conservation, education, and leadership roles. Security officers, front-facing retail staff, and housekeeping are all statistically the most likely to be staff of color. Their roles require a physical presence in the museum, are often on the lowest end of salaries, and hold little positional power in terms of the hierarchy of labor of these museums. It is important to remember that these statistics, as bad as they are progress. And I do not say that to be hopeful. The museums we have inherited were created exclusively by white people, and a deep skepticism is necessary in order to identify the crux of the systemic racism they perpetuate. So once we are in the galleries, there are signs of how the disembodied nature of whiteness performs itself on an institutional level, exposing the internal machinations of whiteness as opposed to just exerting them on the visiting public. This is in the difference in which members of staff are visibly present and the power, which ones are not, and then the power dynamics between those 2 groups. So this brings us to our visual aids and art. And art. So this brings us to our visual aids and art. So remember, we are talking about the fishbowl, not the contents. So the art itself is secondary. What we will be talking about instead is the humble wall label. So in my research, I've developed a taxonomy of 9 ways all of these characteristics of whiteness and these definitions of museums come together. I developed this through research as well as in-person site visits and anecdotal evidence. Some of the nodes I've named have to do with how we experience the physical space of the museum, such as a disembodied presence and experience of the galleries. Much like we talked about in terms of how you have to divest your body of many of its needs. White superiority in the hierarchies of gallery space and display, pride of place and ease of access, and how historic relationalities play out in the dynamics of these. So others have to do with the ways museum staff interpret and order the collections and their impact, like siloed curatorial research and departments, freezing time in order to maintain white superiority, and a colorblind approach to display and interpretation. Others are more abstract, like the many ways absence is experienced as a way to exert power. The one we'll focus on today, wall labels, touches on many of these aspects in different ways. So through my research, I have come to see wall labels as a particularly diabolical example of many of these different characteristics of whiteness in one small, discrete, unassuming piece of foam core. But first, let's talk about what they are. Wall labels, didactic plaques, interpretive text. These small labels carry the following information, pretty standard. Artist name, geographic location, lifetime, name of the work, date of the work, materials used, brief interpretive description, and provenance. They are typically small and just to the left of the work. They're usually printed on foam core, which is the same color as the wall, or sometimes on clear plexiglass, or even just on using vinyl lettering directly on the wall. The process of creating these labels is typically begun by the curator, but goes through an incredibly complicated series of edits, approvals, galleys, etc., involving many different departments before it ever gets on the wall. There is nothing on the walls of these museums that hasn't gone through many different hands and sets of eyes. All of this varies based on the size and complexity of the museum. My label today, for instance, was a pretty quick turnaround, all things considered. So, how does this deceptively simple rectangle play on characteristics of white supremacy culture? First and foremost, wall labels perform a complicated act of erasure in order to exert power. They are created to be invisible vehicles for the interpretation of the curator, who, as we know, is statistically likely to be white. These labels perform the erasure of the white curatorial body in order to maintain its dominance as the only static interpretive material available. These are the experts of the museum and fall high in the hierarchy of labor performed within these museums. They are also notably absent in body. Their intellectual labor is evidenced by the art itself, the written interpretation, the pairings, etc. Wall labels are a paternalistic technology of interpretation. The expertise of the curators highlight only a single type of obtaining and interpreting knowledge. So using Kenneth Jones and Tima Okan's characteristics of white supremacy culture, of which paternalism is one, we see that worship of the written word is an obvious example here. The text is also only written in one language unless a clear effort has been made in a micro exhibition or installation to include additional voices or cultures. This, however, ties into the siloed nature of curatorial education, research, funding, and display that I address in my taxonomy. So the result of works being interpreted in an either-or capacity, if it is a siloed way of researching and interpreting, that means that it's another characteristic of white supremacy culture that's being used. It limits the interpretation, the interpretive perspective to one curatorial department, and it prohibits pieces from being able to tell truly intersectional stories. Wall labels also tie to the way that these museums freeze time in order to maintain white superiority in the experience of the galleries. These museums use a temporal series of organizing and display, which contributes to the understanding of white superiority. White-centric art is shown to have a logical series to its timeline. Developments of style, techniques, complications, etc., are all teased out with white-centric art. However, in the galleries of arts of Africa or South America or Asian art or the Americas, which is of course different than American art, the art objects are often frozen in time and place. In gallery talks and performances and additional programming can and do build connections to past and present. Museum practitioners work incredibly hard to bring this connection and bring these objects to life, and they do excellent work. And they do tell intersectional stories, but they depend on being available during a certain time. These labels are the interpretive foundation because they remain across time. So another characteristic is objectivity. The tone these labels are written is academic English. No shade, but this kind of English has such a power to gaslight, to tone police, and to obscure truths. There are so many examples of harmful obfuscation, whitewashing, tone policing, exoticizing, promoting white saviorism. I could go on and on and on. Um, Wall labels, it's impossible to discuss them all. So I want to highlight an example that I believe is pretty representative, in one from the Art Institute of Chicago for my least favorite, Paul Gauguin, his painting, Marahai Metua no Tehemana, which is a painting of one of Gauguin's young teenage mistresses. The beginning of the text from the wall label, which I viewed in early March of 2020, begins, Tehemana was a Tahitian girl who became Paul Gauguin's companion, and in some ways, the embodiment of his feelings about Tahitian culture. Here, he showed her wearing the prim dress imposed on Native women by European missionaries, a sign that Tahiti was not quite the, quote, primitive paradise the artist had hoped to find. So this work also has an audio guide stop indicated on it on the wall label itself by the headphones icon and the number 796. Because I have the Art Institute's app downloaded on my phone to be able to help members troubleshoot their digital member card, I listened to it. It is old and references Douglas Druick as the president and director of the museum, and he retired several years ago. A portion of the transcript of this audio guide is as follows. Narrator. This painting depicts Gauguin's Tahitian companion, Tehemana. She wears a modest dress of the kind provided by Catholic missionaries, but the fragrant flowers in her hair signal the very sensuality that the dress was intended to obscure. Douglas Druick. He had traveled to find the authentic Tahiti. In the absence of finding it, he had to invent it, and this is a portrait of that invention. Just a quick note that Tehemana is believed to have been 13 years old, roughly, when Gauguin met her, and roughly 14 when he allegedly impregnated her. So this label centers the creative expression of a white man as he exoticized the people, and especially young girls, and the culture of Tahiti. The objective tone serves to validate this interpretation of the work, and the written text solidifies it as truth. So wall labels are also the vehicle for information on provenance, as we talked about, or the history of ownership, essentially. In the majority of cases, only the most recent owner is named, however. The Brooklyn Museum has a few notable examples where they do give the full provenance, but it's in fits and spurts. This tiny logistical seeming detail is another reason why wall labels are too easily dismissed. As deeper provenance is obscured, so is the lasting legacy of imperialism as it currently manifests in capitalism and philanthropy. So this complicated form, this complicated dynamic between museums, capitalism, and philanthropy, because museums do rely on the generous donations of wealthy people in order to survive. It does tie to the absence of from my taxonomy as well. What forms of power are obscured, omitted, absent in our experience of the museum? Another example of the same kind of power being maintained by a physical absence is the names of donors on the walls of galleries. Named gallery spaces are a long-standing best practice for development teams at museums. It anchors the power dynamics of the donors on the very structure of the building, though. You might not notice them, but donor recognition walls are also standard practice. The names of significant donors and trustees are often carved into the walls or otherwise placed in prominent display on the walls of main thoroughfares as you enter. Before you see any art, you often see the names of donors. This kind of institutional body language sometimes speaks volumes, especially since the Met where this photo is taken of David Koch Plaza outside of the Met, has recently laid off 81 employees as a result of their closure from COVID-19, despite having a $3 billion endowment. So that is it for my presentation. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk about the wildly exciting topic of wall labels in museums. Again, this is just one node of the taxonomy I've identified in my thesis, but it is a really rich example of how important it is to ask questions and dig deeper to reveal the power dynamics at play. As I said at the beginning, when we have the ability to spot when we might be reaffirming white supremacy, we have the opportunity to make different choices. I love museums, and I believe in museums, I think. I don't know. I do believe in my colleagues, though. My colleagues at the Art Institute and across the industry. There are so many talented, incredibly dedicated museum practitioners who are doing the work every day to dismantle these nodes and also to build something better. I'm grateful to be a part of that community, and I look forward to what we can create together.